Hey, welcome to episode 144 of Decentralized Revolution. I'm Aaron Harris. My co-host Nate Thurston should be back with us next week. He is out on vacation, and looking forward to checking in with him again. Tonight, I've got a guest that he was on, I think, 3 years ago or so with Liam McCollum when he guest hosted, and I'm talking about Joseph Solis-Mullen of the Libertarian Institute. We've got several things to talk about, but before we get into that, welcome and tell people a little bit about what you do, how you got to be writing for the Libertarian Institute and other places.
Well, thank you for having me, Aaron. Yes, it was a pleasure to join Liam. It's a pleasure to be joining you. Big fan of the show. I started out writing for the Mises Institute, actually, when I was in graduate school. And that led to conversations with Keith Knight and eventually Scott Horton over at the Libertarian Institute, where I wrote a book for them, The Fake China Threat. Became a fellow over there. I still write at the Mises Institute. I do a couple articles a month there, and then I do a weekly piece, usually every Thursday morning, at the Libertarian Institute. I teach history and politics at Spring Arbor University, and I teach economics at Jackson College. I'm currently working on my second book, which came out this last year, which is about the national debt and you, what it is, why it matters. Very timely, according to public opinion polls, and the fact that can't seem to even make a dent on the deficit, let alone the debt. And then I'm working on my third book, which is First Steps in Search of Monsters to Destroy U.S. Foreign Policy from 1865 to 1898.
Yeah, and that's based on, is that the quote from John Quincy Adams?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good one that too many people have forgotten. It is amazing when you look at the founders, how they really thought about foreign policy and how different it is than what we're stuck with now. And we're going to get into kind of a big aspect of American foreign policy that Scott Horton and others have talked about for a few years, that is that so-called pivot to Asia. And also, there's stuff happening with the Federal Reserve and Trump, obviously, that I want to ask you about, and different fiscal and monetary policy stuff. But before that, something you wrote here fairly recently is kind of a topic that's kind of personal to me. Is I guess a biography of William F. Buckley Jr. came out, and some of my history is how I got to be a libertarian. Basically, I was a Reagan kid. I was like 4 or 5 when he was elected, and was always just kind of a fan of him and anti-communist. And so naturally, at some point, like in junior high, I found National Review magazine, and National Review, it was, and I guess it's still going, but it is kind of strange. If you look at its history and the type of people it's published, there are some very hardcore libertarians and then neocons and pretty much everywhere in between. And I was kind of before I read, and even a little bit after I read Rothbard at around age 18, I was kind of like a hardcore ANCAP as far as like domestic policy, but I was kind of like a Cold Warrior type on foreign policy. And obviously later I kind of figured out how that doesn't quite, work together and came around. But sort of the one of the big figures in my development and learning about politics was William F. Buckley Jr., who of course founded and edited for a long time National Review. And at the time I loved him. And I think I always thought, looking back, he was kind of like almost like the Ben Shapiro of his day. Like, he was known for owning the libs, right? Only he did it in a very erudite way on Firing Line, PBS show and stuff like this. But he kind of served that same purpose that Ben Shapiro serves for some people today in my book. Talk about this review, and you wrote a piece on it for the Libertarian Institute. You wrote a piece on a biography and someone else's review of it from our perspective. So tell me your take on Buckley and your piece.
Right. So there's the book itself, which is just an absolute tome. I mean, it's a huge book, and it's a biography that was official. Buckley approved of him writing it, gave him permission, gave him many, many interviews. It was a book that was 25, 30 years in the making. So there's the book itself. which is one thing. And those who listen to your podcast are no doubt familiar with the career trajectory and the place that William Buckley holds in conservative circles. He is the one who helped shut out the old right and usher in the new right, the one who had made peace with the state, who had made peace with big government. Then there's the Review, which is what I was specifically responding to, because the Review, which came out in Foreign Affairs, which, whatever. The university gets copies of all these magazines. So I'll just plop down in the reading room during a free period and read, for example, National Review, which I'll circle back to that, because hearing you describe your own background, it was like, yep, this is very much meshing with me. That's exactly how I was. Okay.
Yep.
That was my upbringing as well. Very, very funny there. But the Review that came out was sprinkled with all sorts of commentary about how Buckley and his vision for America is being made manifest in Donald Trump. And how everything that Buckley thought he wanted but didn't really like, and the isolationism and all this stuff, like, it's all being made manifest now, and this is all Buckley's fault. Yeah. And it was just this completely bizarro review that was really very baffling to me. And so I had to write about it, because the biography is, it's a biography. It's pretty glowing. It covers all aspects of his life, but it's very glowing. And, as far as the book itself goes, like, it's fine. I mean, it's a biography. But the review itself was just completely twisting it around, like that Buckley had laid the seeds for what 2016 Trump represented. And it was like, nope, you need to, either you're trying to, gaslight all of us, or you're genuinely confused by what Trump wanted to do. I don't blame any libertarian-minded person who looked at candidate 2016 Trump and was like, that's someone I could see myself voting for there. Right. Because, Murray Rothbard always said, war is the number one issue. Whatever else you want to say, like, you cannot have. And you talked about being a Reaganite guy and like an ANCAP domestically, but still wanting to pursue that militarist foreign policy abroad, and coming to the conclusion that actually you can't do that. Yep. You have to choose. And that's something that Rothbard, which I encountered Rothbard right around the time I was 18 as well. And it was a really life-changing thing, because I was raised in a Reaganite household, and I was Catholic and went to parochial school. Okay. So like National Review was literally like around the house. Yep. You know what I mean? So it's interesting there. So
some context there is Buckley was a big Catholic, and a lot of that National Review, their editors and writers, they were a lot of Catholics and then a lot of neocons, and so I could see
straight where that ex-commies.
Yeah. So like
straight up ex-commies.
As Scott Horton, I think he, I can't remember if it's him or Daryl Cooper or the two of them together on their podcast, or either of them on Tucker's podcast, kind of defined what a neocon is, which was a very specific group of people who were former socialists in like the 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah. Justin Raimondo has an article that people can look up on antiwar.com. I think it's called "Who Are the Neocons?" And he gives you like the whole backstory on that.
Right. And those people, Buckley kind of brought them into under the aegis of National Review and gave them a voice so National Review was founded in like early 50s, I think. And I think, Buckley was CIA, wasn't he? Like,
I don't know that Buckley was CIA. I know there's always been a little bit of confusion there, because there was a CIA station chief named Bill Buckley.
Okay.
Around Sam, who eventually he gets killed in like Lebanon, I think it was back in the 80s. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if William F. Buckley.
I think he was. Yeah, I think he did. I think he was Skull and Bones, and then all of that stuff. And so there's some speculation that the CIA kind of funded, National Review and stuff like that. And so talk about just so he brought in the neocons, but then he did what to the old right? and
well, then he shuts out the old right,
yeah,
and basically his role was really helping to. I'm from Michigan.
yeah,
Michigan is where the Overton window expression comes from.
okay,
He really helped redefine what was acceptable opinion
yeah,
for a conservative, and he really helped normalize what the Eisenhower administration was doing, which Eisenhower is someone who's, unobjectionable, yet. Well, he was serving as a college president, and he was open to running for president, just period.
yeah,
And it wasn't until the last minute that he decided to go on the Republican ticket. But his version, I don't even know if I should say it's his version. I mean, he was a federal employee, military man. Like, he believed that the state could do good things, and he believed, in keeping the New Deal. He called it the dime store New Deal, which was this idea that we can have all these welfare programs, but we Republicans, we can manage them better.
yeah.
And we'll make them more thrifty. And that was the whole thing, being able to bring down those budget deficits. And, the 50s, especially after the Korean War, I mean, the 50s really were a period of pretty incredible economic growth. The United States was really able to just take huge bites out of the debt, which I know we'll talk about at some point there. So it did seem like at the time, oh yeah, we can have these programs, and look, see, we're doing all these things. But it was a very particular moment, and it opened the door to statism being mainstream in the Republican Party. Though the people who had opposed vigorously the New Deal, the Chodorovs, even the Tafts, which Taft was, he's a complicated figure there, but.
Yep. Yeah, and so like Buckley did almost like canceling certain people like Rothbard and of course I'm blanking on it, but different people. I know he had, was it Whitaker Chambers wrote a famous review of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and basically accused her almost of being a Nazi, and so it's like the same sort of like cancel culture type stuff we see today was done in a very sort of high level literary way at National Review to kind of tar these people. And again, at the time, like in the 50s and really through the 80s, especially, and up until cable news, there was newspapers, there was PBS, NBC, ABC, CBS, and there was magazines. And all of those things are very, very costly to run, especially on a national setting. So like, having a magazine with national circulation was, having a huge amount of power over what people could actually even access. So again, so like you and I discovered some of this through going to the library and getting a physical copy of a magazine that I'm sure all the other kids thought we were weird for reading, but so that just showed how few avenues for these ideas were. And so a respected magazine with that, he was a guest on all the big TV networks and stuff like that. So someone who had the stamp of approval from the mainstream media had a lot of power. And he really did systematically, there were some libertarians who did kind of hang around, and libertarian views were in National Review, but if you look at the trend overall, he really did kill and sideline a lot of those old right people. And so we ended up with, them advocating small government, or at least, New Deal on the cheap type stuff. Even Reagan was kind of like that. So the libertarian rhetoric on domestic policy, but then on foreign policy, the hardcore Cold Warrior stuff that was.
That's it. It's the rhetoric.
Right.
The rhetoric stuck around.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's exactly what Eisenhower warned against, the military industrial complex. The foreign policy served that. And so all the other sort of domestic policy stuff was actually kind of a sideshow, I think, because Buckley and his people, they really were Cold Warriors, and that was their main goal. So they were willing to entertain all kinds of different ideas domestically, as long as the defense contracts kept getting
It's
filled.
it's a very famous or infamous article, depending on what your perspective is. I remember I gave a talk several years ago over in the Albion College area, and Buckley had said, look, we have to make peace with a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores for the duration of the Cold War. And you think about when Eisenhower was saying, beware the military industrial complex. I mean, it was just getting started at that point, really. I mean, it hadn't even really taken off yet. So you think about by the time the war ended, the Cold War ended in the late 80s. I mean, there was no chance. There was no chance at all. Even someone like Reagan, who, yes, he had been a very successful governor, but he had White House ambitions. He'd been beaten back several times. But when he got there, policy just got taken over by the same Beltway policy people who said, that's great, Mr. President, keep up that great rhetoric and stuff. But Dave Stockman, he wrote that great book about the failure of the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's director of the budget. It's just not going to happen. And it's why, when Elon Musk and Donald Trump were touting the Department of Government Efficiency and all this, and this, people were getting really excited. This was back in November, December. I started writing articles kind of poo-pooing it, saying, guys, look, I want to believe this too, but let me tell you a story about what's actually going to happen here. And here we are, unfortunately. Even with these record tariff revenues coming in, the deficit is just continuing to go up.
Let's go ahead and transition into that sort of stuff now. There's some things happening that really haven't happened before. You mentioned the tariffs, and then just the level of how the national debt has grown. It's such a big topic. I'll let you dive in with however you want to get your handle on it. What is the fiscal situation like as of now? Oh, I think I lost
sorry.
you.
So sorry. Someone was moving around out there. I muted my mic. I'm sorry.
Okay.
The situation is extremely bad. We just crossed 37 trillion in terms of what we've already spent. So let's just right now, for the sake of argument, forget about the unfunded liabilities. Mm-hmm. Let's forget about all the promissory notes where the government took your money and scribbled down IOU for the future for some Social Security or some Medicare, whatever, down the road. That's well over $100 trillion. Depending on how you calculate it, you can get it up to close to $200 trillion. So if you want to say $150 trillion in unfunded liabilities, cool. Plus 37 trillion, about $200 trillion is where we're at. Mm-hmm. It's obviously tough because the budget changes year by year, tends to increase, but so it's hard to say. It's also hard to know what the discount rate is going to be. We don't know, what the yield is going to be. We don't know what the inflation rate is going to be. So it's very hard to look out into the future. But I will say that anytime you get a government statistic, and I know that, right now the whole thing is like, oh, Trump fired the person who does the statistics. Back in 2020, the Congressional Budget Office was saying, listen, don't worry about it, guys. We're not going to hit $37 trillion in debt until 2030. Boom. Here we are.
Yep.
Here we are. That's government work for you right there.
So what changed?
You can't be that wrong in your job. You get fired if you're that wrong.
So what happened? What happened over the last 5 years for that?
I mean, very well. I mean, the COVID spending, and it never went down. This is Robert Higgs's ratchet effect. Right. If you guys aren't familiar with Robert Higgs's Crisis in Leviathan, that great book by the Independent Institute way back, 35 years ago, something like that. But he showed that, look, the crisis happens. People go, oh my God, government, please do something. And government does something. And then the crisis abates and the government gives a little bit of that power back, a little bit of that budget back, but it's never back to where it was. We're on a permanently new level. And then we keep going until the next crisis comes. Boom, it jumps up. And then it comes back a little bit. And that's the situation we've been in. As I said, even with the Trump administration's record-breaking revenue coming in, the deficit and the debt continue to grow unabated. No question. So the big problem right now is the sheer amount and the interest payments. So we're talking about the debt servicing cost. It's over $1 trillion. It's over $1 trillion. It's more than
per year.
Per year. It's over $1 trillion a year, and it's only going up. So it was 1.126 trillion in fiscal 2024. That's 13% of all government expenditure, more than Medicare and the Pentagon budget.
Yep.
Now, by the time we actually hit 2030, again, I hate making predictions because the thing about the future is you might be wrong.
Yeah.
But by 2030, if inflation stays at about 3% and the deficit stays at about, I don't know, $2-3 trillion, and interest rates stay at about 4 or 5, I mean, I could easily see us having 30-40% of the government's budget going to that. And at that point, we do start to have to talk about how much inflation is there going to be, because I have advocated for years defaulting. Yep. Just defaulting. And I know some of the listeners are going to be like, well, inflation is defaulting. Well, yes, it's defaulting, but like everyone borrowing knows that. Everyone borrowing knows that.
Yeah.
And if you're really concerned about it, you can buy inflation protected bonds.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about a literal, we're not going to pay anymore. Not even like a haircut. Not even like Nixon, who back when he closed the gold window was like, you're all getting a haircut. Mm-hmm. You're going to take 30% of par. Yeah. I'm talking stop paying on it right away. And yes, it would destroy the government's credit, but I don't actually care about that because they need the credit card taken away. And the only way to take the credit card away is to have someone else take the credit card away. Yep. The government takes in trillions of dollars in revenue each year, $4 trillion in revenue each year. Whatever it wants to be doing, it needs to be able to do it with $4 trillion. Yep. $2 trillion deficits have become the norm. And I know I was just making fun of the Congressional Budget Office, but for what it's worth, they say that we're going to run $2 trillion deficits every year from now until the middle of the 2030s. Yeah. Yep. That's and that was news. That was a headline right about the time the book was going to press. And so I real quick went back and added that in there. And it didn't even make like an impact on the news cycle at all. Right. And which is crazy because I was doing my undergraduate right around the time of like the Tea Party, back when the national debt was like 9 trillion and it was like the issue. Mm-hmm. Now we're closing in on $40 trillion with no end in sight. And everyone's just kind of like, but we need new nukes. And, we need to give money to the semiconductor companies. And, no one wants their entitlements cut. Yep. So whatever. As a young person, especially, I'm like, oh my goodness, we've got to stop this. We have to stop this. I know that those people who are 70, 80 years old, whatever, like, not to say that they all don't care, but like, it's really our problem. Yeah. If you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, like you got to understand, like this is a huge problem for you. You're never seeing any of that money.
Well, given the fact that they're probably not going to repudiate the debt in a, the way a President Ron Paul or Murray Rothbard would do, what are they going to try to do?
Well, they're going to probably try some tricks of financial repression. They're going to try to probably run inflation a little bit higher, maybe like 3% rather than 2%. I mean, obviously they'd love to be able to let it rip and get it up to like 5%, but that's politically just not tolerable. Mm-hmm. That being said, I mean, we should obviously also address that, the idea that inflation is the expansion of the money supply. The money supply has been expanding unabated for years. Trump, you hear he's pressuring Jerome Powell to cut interest rates to make money cheaper. It's important to understand the money supply has not been contracting. The money supply has been expanding. It's been expanding since he took office. It was expanding long before that. So the problem is not interest rates going lower. That's honestly only going to make things worse from the perspective of someone who's anti-inflation. But no, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? They're going to continue to try and kick the can down the road. Mm-hmm. They're going to try and inflate away some of the real value there. And then they're going to put pressure on allied governments and companies to try and get them to help bail Washington out. You saw just the other day that basically they told NVIDIA and AMD, if you want to sell your chips in China, you have to give us 15% of the sales.
Wow, I hadn't heard that.
And I see that as a blueprint for how they're going to be going forward. Because, I mean, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government measure, right?
Right.
So you could see this getting expanded because they need more revenue.
Yeah.
And okay, so obviously, like you said, they're not just going to stand up and say, we repudiate the debt, whatever. So you have to come up with other ways to keep the thing going. And the problem is, just the very short time horizons that these politicians have. Like if you're a congressperson, you're facing your constituents every 2 years. And yes, something like 75% of people polled across like Isthmus, Gallup, all these different ones, which tend to skew Democrat. And they're the ones who want more generally to spend more money, so this statistic is crazy to me because it's actually probably even more solidly. People don't want the debt to get bigger. They are concerned about the debt. But if you come back as their representative and say, hey, I cut funding to our area. Hey, I also raised your taxes. We're going to balance these books.
Yeah.
You're getting voted out.
Right.
You're getting voted out. Whereas if you come back and say, hey, got some subsidies for the new sports stadium also, cut your taxes, which like, hey, I'm all about cutting taxes. The problem is that the government is going to inflate. You're going to pay that tax elsewhere.
Yep.
So no, I don't know. I mean, we're at a point now where, it's not that the government doesn't take in enough money. It's taking like $4 trillion a year. It's not difficult to imagine. I wrote an article several months back, and it's at the Libertarian Institute. People can find it. Something like, could we pay off the debt or something like that? Where I basically said, look, sure, guys, we can make all kinds of assumptions. We could assume that the government cut spending by 10%, ran inflation at 4.5%, and, kept the same tax take, and we'd be out of this in 30 years.
Yeah.
But these aren't realistic things.
Right.
I view default as just a matter of either we can choose the moment or the moment can be forced upon us.
Yeah.
So I think it's better to choose your moment.
Well, but like you say, and we learn things like this from people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, that the politicians literally all their incentives are in the opposite direction, is to wait until some other guy is on the hook for the problem that they've caused. And they all get to go back and say, when I was a newspaper reporter, the local congressman would campaign and they're like, oh, well, I bring back for every dollar the people in Ohio's whatever district sent to Washington, I've brought back X number of, and I'm like, yeah, but everybody does that because they're running a deficit. Like it's literally how it works. That's not anything everybody gets back more than they're putting in because of the deficit spending. So they have no incentive, other than if they just happen to be someone like Thomas Massey or Ron Paul or somebody like that, who actually cares about it, to stand up and try to do something about it now. So, it's mind-boggling. And the thing of it is, it's been that way our whole lives, and we've all seen this coming, but the system can't do anything about it. So,
well, it's gotten worse.
Yeah,
it's gotten worse, and part of it has to do. And in the book, I talk about the history of the Fed taking advantage of the gains from globalization to run interest rates much lower than they should have been, particularly in the 1990s, for example. Alan Greenspan, who was constantly finding reasons to keep the interest rate low. The tequila crisis, the Russia crisis, the East Asia crisis, Y2K, cut rates because Y2K is about to happen. So Who knows? We'll just put a little extra cash in the system, right?
Yep.
At the same time, creating this incredible moral hazard. So, we have these gains from globalization that are helping keep consumer prices down as manufacturing is being done in these lower wage areas. And these savings are being passed on to American consumers, so the interest rate can stay lower without, the consumer price index jumping up, right?
Yeah.
And then, 9/11 happens, and there's a lot of political pressure to keep rates low, because we're going to do a bunch of war spending, and they did like a bunch of entitlement expansions as well, and they cut taxes, huge tax cut. Then the 2007-2008 crash comes, and then rates went even lower. Yep. And there were incredible distortions in the bond market, for one, which encouraged very reckless moves into equities, and that's why we got an asset price bubble, right? That's why asset prices massively departed their long run trend after 2007-2008, and so that had all sorts of negative consequences for people who like want to buy a home or something, like their first home. It's hard to see these things though when you're sitting there in the moment and the television is telling you like, well, it's because BlackRock is buying all the homes or something, like and it's really incredible to think about how far back these things go, and how it's not going to be an easy fix. Like there is no easy fix for a problem that goes back 30, 35 years. And in terms of the debt, the government got very used to costless borrowing, right? When the government can borrow money at like 0.5%, 1%, as much as they want for years on end, you're going to get some bad habits there. You're going to get some bad habits there. As you said, they have every incentive to behave irresponsibly in the first place. And when you tell them, hey, here's a credit card with virtually no interest on it at all, and the biggest thing for me is not refinancing all that debt to lock in those rates. So little of that is actually at that 1.5%. And when we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars, 1% or 0.5%, like that means big things over the course of 30 years. So,
tell me about the tariffs. Like I again, as libertarians, most of us should be against all that. And, we see economic theory is pretty clear. In some ways I could see using that as like a negotiating tactic to overall bring tariffs down or something like that. But like how much, so they're going into effect. What you've already said, there's a lot of revenue coming in. Doesn't that, so I would imagine if the price of something goes up, less of it's going to come in. So like what's going on there? It's such a huge thing that we haven't seen in a long time. What do we know about what's actually happening as far as how much money is coming in, how much it's depressing imports or affecting exports or whatever?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of regime uncertainty right now because one day the tariffs are going to be this high. The next day they're going to be that high. They're starting tomorrow. They're being paused for 90 days. He just put a pause on the China tariffs that were supposed to kick in. And it's like, so it's very hard to say. And I know from talking with people in the business world that like, this is just, it's tough. It's tough, especially if you're a small or medium-sized business. If you're a massive corporation, it's a pain, but like you have whole departments of economists and supply chain people who deal with this. Like you'll figure it out. You have access to multiple suppliers. A lot of these corporations were building alternate supply networks post-COVID anyway, building in some redundant capacity. Those costs did get passed on to consumers, but just kind of insulate themselves from supply shocks. But no, so I mean, tariffs are taxes. Tariffs are government intervention in the economy. They do lead to suboptimal outcomes. As you said, this is all pretty basic neoclassical economics. In terms of them as a negotiating tool, the U.S. market is very important. It's the market everybody wants to have. It's the consumer market that everybody wants to have access to. And trying to use that to secure better, more favorable deals, what the administration perceives as better deals. From a libertarian perspective, for me, the kind of really shocking thing is the extent to which the president can just intervene in the economy like this. And I mean, it's kind of like it's like a non-story, right? They treat it like it's an executive order shuffling around the Department of Agriculture or something like that. It's really incredible.
Well,
And
let me ask you about that. So like when I think I was freshman year of college, I think was when like the NAFTA thing was getting negotiated, which is North American Free Trade Agreement, which obviously wasn't entirely free trade. Um, the agreement between US, Canada, and Mexico, and it had to be voted on by Congress. It was, I think, treated like a treaty or something. And there was intense public debate for weeks and weeks and weeks about it. And, Clinton and Gore got it passed. Ross Perot campaigned against it. But it finally passed. But like under what authority is he doing this? Obviously he has the power to do it, but like, I just always assumed that things like that had to go through Congress in some way, but what do I know?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the imperial presidency.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Congress, I always like to tell my students, guys, up until the very end of the Roman Empire in the West, there was still a Senate.
Yep.
They still met and deliberated and held elections and gave speeches and ran campaigns, and people treated it like it really meant something.
Yeah.
For centuries, even though it didn't matter at all.
Yep.
And that, to me, it's very clear that everything runs out of the White House.
Yeah.
No matter who's president. And you say like, well, the spending bills originate in the House and stuff. And it's like, but what are these bills though? They're not actual like line items. These are just huge things that basically it's a continuing resolution that we're just going to keep funding everything.
Yeah.
And just borrow the money and kick the can down the road.
Yep.
And you can't do real legislation.
Yeah.
There are not enough votes, and there's not enough willingness on the part of politicians to frankly, like meet in the middle, moderate their positions, and do some kind of legislation. Because if you look at the last time that happened, and I'm going to set aside the bipartisanship of the Iraq War, which and Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, that's kind of an anomaly there. If you go back to the 1990s, when this was going on, you had Clinton and Gingrich both expending large amounts of political capital to raise taxes and cut spending, including on entitlements, in order to balance the budget. And so there was a period there in the late 90s, early 2000s, where our ship of state, again, there was all those unfunded liabilities in the future, but the actual debt itself was slated to be completely eliminated by 2010. But
well, wasn't there
incredible discipline?
Yeah.
That takes incredible discipline. Gingrich already had his eye on the door. Clinton was a lame duck. He didn't really have anything to worry about. That's what you need. You need people who are not concerned about getting reelected. Who are also in positions to actually use the whip and get members to do this stuff.
Right.
So,
I think there was actually one year in the late 90s there where there wasn't a deficit.
There was a surplus.
Yeah, there was a surplus for just like one. Yeah. And then obviously, it's almost like a gambler who is in the hole and, finally gets out of the hole with a big score and then has learned nothing from all of that, the last 20 years of misery, and just goes right back into it.
Yeah. Then George W. Bush and Dick Cheney took office, and Dick Cheney told us, don't worry, guys. I was just at the American Enterprise Institute and they told me deficits don't even matter.
Yeah. So The National Debt and You is your latest book, Joseph Solis-Mullen, and it's published by the Libertarian Institute. So go to libertarianinstitute.org/books. And the page I'm looking at, that's the first one right up there next to Provoked. Have you heard of this book, Provoked, by Scott Horton? But it's up there. So check that out. So I want to pivot, pun very intentionally intended, to your previous book, which is called The Fake China Threat and Its Very Real Danger. People who listen to this show a lot know that I have a particular interest in American foreign policy in Asia because I've got family in Taiwan. And, I want Taiwan to be free and independent, but I also don't want war of any kind. So tell us what tell us what's going on in, we know the trade stuff with the tariffs and all that, but what's the status of the pivot to Asia, China, Taiwan policy? What's the latest now that Trump has been back in office for a few months?
Well, thankfully, Taiwan hasn't really been the focus of discussions, which is always good. You know, I look at the history, which I've written quite a bit on the history of relations between China and Taiwan and the United States. And I look back on periods in like the 1980s where there was like virtually nothing going on for, years and years. And it was like, gosh, I want that back so badly, instead of every morning, turning on my computer and checking, did something happen? No, because it is the big flashpoint. Like yourself. So I'll just say this. This is probably unsurprising, but look, of course, I want political entities to be as small as possible. In like the Greek city-state polis type way. Aristotle didn't believe that, government by vote by people like that. He didn't believe that was impossible or a necessarily bad form of government. He distinguished between democracy, which was bad, and the polis, which was good. This was the good form of democracy, if you want to think of it as that. Democracy is just everyone voting, right? He said, look, if you have it in a closed off, small group, homogenous little city state, yes, it can be good. So I don't feel like democracy works when cities and states get too big, which is why he believed that city states, once they got a little bit too big, had to be ruled by a tyrant.
Right.
That they had to be ruled in an imperial manner. And no state in the history of humanity has proven that wrong. So of course I want Taiwan to be self-governing. I would love the individual little cantons to be even more self-governing, just as I would like, I think Hans Hermann Hoppe said, I don't want a single Europe. I want a Europe of 1,000 states. Right? Of course we do. Of course we do. The question, as you put it, was, can this happen without war? And my concern is actually a little bit more specific. I know you have family there, so you just want to make sure there's no war, period. And of course, I don't want war either. My concern is that if the United States is not involved in that war, it will be over in an afternoon. Taiwan, say whatever you want about, phenomenal economy, great place to live, etc. They've never spent enough on GDP of their GDP on defense for the situation that they're in. Right. Imagine you have an incredibly large and armed neighbor next door whose declared intention is to make your house theirs. I would personally be spending quite a bit on defense, but they haven't been. But
and not just a neighbor. The neighbor has 200 family members, as opposed to your 4 in your house.
Exactly. But they never have, because it's always been understood. Increasingly, explicitly so, that the United States would intervene. And actually, 2 days ago, the president of the Philippines, who's actually the son of a former U.S. backed dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, his son basically said, look, if there's a war over Taiwan, we're going to be involved. And it's I'm not trying to like pick on him or anything. I thought his comments were very honest, and I do believe that he is bummed out about it. He was like, we're gonna get dragged into it, kicking and screaming. We literally just don't have a choice. And it's true. Their security partner is the United States. They need the United States. They have allowed the United States to build tons of military bases and move military assets onto Taiwan. New force postures, a lot of mobile rocket launchers and missile launchers and things like that onto those northern islands that are looking directly across at Taiwan there. That's been where a lot of the clashes are. I think, a lot of hay gets thrown about Australia and Japan and stuff, but really it's been the Philippines and Beijing who have been butting heads the hardest over the last really probably 8 years. I mean, with over the shoals, the Scarborough Shoal, there was just an incident 2 days ago, or maybe it was yesterday. I think it was 2 days ago, where the Chinese patrol boats tried to ram a Philippine vessel, and wound up colliding, with their partner vessel. And, then the United States conducted a freedom of navigation exercise there near the shoal that China is claiming and pretty much is occupied. And, so the Chinese claim that they chased off the, frigate that was sent. And I mean, it's all very sketchy. I mean, there was actually one a few years ago where a Chinese Coast Guard boat boarded a Philippine boat, and there was actual fighting with like knives and machetes and sticks and fists, and some dude got his thumb chopped off. And yeah, if war had started at that point, I was gonna definitely write the book "The War for Macondo's Thumb." That was the guy's name.
Yeah. War of Jenkins' ear. Yeah,
I was so ready. I was like, well, if we're all gonna die here soon in some huge war, I'm just gonna real quick write out this. So no, it's scary because there are so many overlapping territorial claims there in the South China Sea, and the East China Sea isn't as bad because it's mostly just Taiwan and China and Japan. But that South China Sea, man, it's jam-packed. It's a very important waterway for global trade. Of course, the United States has a huge naval presence there. They've said they're committed to fighting for Japan and the Philippines claims to these outlying I mean, this is basically a sandbar.
Yep.
And the Senkaku Islands, like those are just like rocks, basically. I mean, it's pretty incredible. I mean, China, I was just reading an article about Chinese shipbuilding capacity. They have about 100 times the shipbuilding capacity as the United States does today. And you might say, well, but Joe, is this, all blue water capable stuff? It's like the fights that we're talking about are taking place 90 miles off the coast of China.
Yeah.
They don't need, 12 super carriers to go refight the Battle of Midway. They want to control their neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's all they've ever wanted here. Their doctrine is explicitly area denial. They want to be able to control their immediate environs.
Yeah.
And so my great fear is that we're going to wind up with basically a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
Where they've got the island blocked off in a blockade, and we're sending supply ships.
Okay.
And it's going to be up to, at some point, those ships are going to get close, right?
Yep.
And decisions are going to need to be made. Are we going to stop? Are they going to fire? Are you going to fire on these ships?
Mm-hmm.
What happens if you try and run this blockade and there's a collision? What's going to happen then? I do not like it. I don't like it at all. Obviously I would love for the situation to just remain the same, but it's hard to know what's going to happen there.
Well, explain, we've said it a couple of times, the pivot to Asia, what that is,
right.
and in relation to the title of your book, The Fake China Threat.
So the pivot to Asia, basically, so there was this whole idea of development theory. And it was this idea that by engaging with China, by tying communist China into the international framework of international organizations, the global economy, that this would produce rising standards of living in China, that this would produce a middle class who would then demand political rights. This is how it had happened in the West, after all. And our experience is virtually universal. That's why history is over, and everyone is basically eventually going to be a liberal capitalist democracy, right? You've all heard of that book or that theory. But there were some bumps in the road. And there were always skeptics. There were always people who were very skeptical of this strategy that was really starting to be heavily pursued in the 1990s. Because, of course, in the 1980s, the raison d'etre was nothing to do with China liberalizing. Yeah, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. It was about pressure on the Soviets. Two-front pressure on the Soviets. Once the Soviet Union was gone, then you needed to justify this continued policy of engagement with China. That's where that came from.
Yeah.
Well, by the late 2000s, early 2010s, it was becoming clear that nope, they're not actually liberalizing. Actually, they're getting super rich and powerful, far too powerful for Washington's comfort, right? Washington as an offshore balancer, as a power that is isolated, kind of like a giant Great Britain, right? It's like this big floating island. And so it comes over to other regions and just tries to prevent any other power from becoming powerful enough to dominate its region.
Right.
Because if it could become a regional hegemon, it might be able to keep U.S. interests out of there. Whatever. I mean, whatever. I'm a public choice theory guy. I don't really think like the U.S. has like quote unquote interests, but that's basically the thinking there. And so all the people have been saying, you idiots, what are you doing? You're playing around in the sandbox over there. What are you doing? You should be focusing on China. Finally, Kurt Campbell, who had been a big China hawk going back to the 90s, he was part of the Clinton administration. He finally gets a high-ranking position. He was kind of like a mid-level, like nobody in the State Department, or maybe he was in the Defense Department. He was a policy wonk. He gets a high-level position in the Obama in the Obama administration and says, "Look, he gets in Clinton's ear and he says we've got to start focusing on Asia. It doesn't matter. The Middle East is all blown up. Whatever. Oops." We need to focus on China. China is here. China is a potential peer competitor. We've got to start working to kneecap them right now. And so Clinton writes that article about the pivot to Asia in Foreign Affairs, and Obama announces it. And, no one could miss it. No one could miss what this meant. Shifting more U.S. military resources to East Asia. Why? I mean, there's Japan, that's an ally. South Korea, that's an ally. Who is this being directed against? It's kind of like NATO expansion, right? Yeah. They're like, it's not directed at anyone. We're just expanding it in a random direction, And the Russians are like, well, this is obviously directed at us. Like, no, who said that? No one said that. And China's saying, whoa, what's with all this? And America, the Washington's like, well, we're not like targeting you. We're not trying to contain you or something. Quit being so paranoid, China. And this was actually where the TPP came from. Do you remember the TPP? You mentioned NAFTA. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was going to be NAFTA for Southeast Asia.
Right.
And Trump campaigned against it, if you remember.
Yep.
Well, the whole point of that, the reason the Obama administration came up with that idea in 2012, 2013, 2014, was they wanted to build a free trade zone in Southeast Asia, which is where the plurality of global economic activity goes on, and then deliberately exclude China from it.
Okay.
So the whole idea of the TPP was, we're going to sacrifice some of the American manufacturing base's interests, but this is all in the name of fighting China, which was always the U.S. foreign policy there. I wrote an article about the U.S. policy post-World War II. It was trading the U.S. industrial base for security priorities.
Okay. So the security, the U.S. priority is to remain a sole superpower and to not let China basically project it. Well, anyone, but to not, and China, what you're saying is China wants to just exercise either hegemony or just great influence over its sphere of influence in that part of the world. But the U.S. doesn't want that. So China is not expansionist in the sense of they're going to be landing troops on Pearl Harbor or the Aleutian Islands. They just want, they want Taiwan. They want to be the big man on the block there. And we don't want them to get any bigger. So the pivot to Asia is just to stop them from growing as a regional power.
And interestingly, you mentioned Taiwan, originally when Mao in the 30s and 40s was talking about his future China, Taiwan wasn't a part of it.
Right.
Taiwan had not it had been part of China's sphere of influence. Yep. It was part of the general Sinosphere over there. But it wasn't until Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT made it their home base and said that we are going to use Taiwan as a launch point to retake the mainland that Mao was like, okay, now we're going to have to conquer Taiwan. Right. And we tend to look at it from our present perspective of like, oh, Taiwan is this democracy that just wants to be left alone. It was a dictatorial police state headed by one guy whose avowed aim was to get the United States involved in a war with communist China so that he could reinvade the mainland and conquer it. Right. And he didn't give up on trying to do this until the 1960s, the late 1960s. So it's very, very different for people who aren't familiar with the history there. And yes, for, let's see, for 2,000 years, well, let's say 1,600 years. Let's say about 1,600 years. The Chinese state has been the overwhelming hegemonic power in that region. Yes, some dynasties were bigger, some were weaker, some were smaller, whatever. It's pretty much true. And certainly it's very culturally and economically true if you look at the region. Then about 150 years ago, the Chinese, they had like the worst 19th century of anyone. I mean, there were a lot of countries that had bad 19th centuries, but they had like the worst one.
Mhm.
And they got laid low and torn apart and taken, it's called the century of humiliation for a reason, from 1850 to 1950. And so if you look at Chinese history as being basically a 2,000-year story,
Yeah.
if you're sitting there in China and you're a Chinese person, like, it looks like you were pretty much on top of the pile for all of history. And then just recently had kind of one little dip, and now things are back where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So this is really just kind of a return to the norm in terms of the balance of power in that region. Thankfully, there are a million reasons, well, not literally a million, but there are about a half dozen good reasons to believe that China is going to struggle to be a regional hegemon in the same way the United States is, and to seriously doubt that even if it wanted to be more than that it could. And those are all the cases that I lay out in the book, which is, look, the only thing China is a real threat to in terms of the United States is the U.S. Navy being able to do whatever it wants right up in China's nose. And that's a direct quote coming right from Bob Woodward, who is, the court historian par excellence. I mean, he's got Tillerson telling Trump, Mr. President, you don't understand. If China gets any more powerful, they will threaten the total U.S. domination of the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. Right up to the shores of China itself. That's what that's what Americans are being told to fight for. That's the interest that's at stake. That's the real threat. Right. That China can't be bought and bullied in the way that like Sudan can, or South Sudan. Either Sudan. No offense to Sudan.
No, and I think that ultimately all this is to some degree influenced by just defense contractors and that part of the economy wanting to make sure they got big beautiful ships, right? Orders for to keep building things. The U.S. government keeps spending money, and if we manufacture a new threat and make it bigger than it really is, and people get rich off of that, and which goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the fiscal stuff. The people in charge don't have any incentive to look 20 years down the road as to what actually is the best solution for the country. It's, oh, well, there's a defense plant in my district and they want me to vote for this. So okay. So my hope as far as like China, Taiwan is like, growing up, obviously we, at least I thought that, I kind of bought all the rhetoric about the Soviet Union and being expansionist and kind of an inevitable thing that would just kind of be there forever, before I really realized, economics and, what actually happened. My hope is that there are cracks in that empire of the Chinese Communist Party that, when we least expect it, things will come apart and there will be liberalization and hopefully political fragmentation. Do you see any signs of something like that happening, or are we just is it going to happen when nobody expects it?
Well, I think I would certainly err on betting on the latter.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, that there is a sort of a cultural gap, especially younger people who have grown up in affluent China. Mm-hmm. There's a big disconnect there, and there was something of that with us, like my grandparents who were literal like teenagers during the Great Depression.
Yep.
There was this like it shaped them. Yep. It formed their mentality, and it never left them. And so there is a big gap between older Chinese who experienced things like the Cultural Revolution, for example, or the incredible poverty of the 70s and 80s. Yep. And the younger people now today who are like, what's the big deal? We're, things are great. I mean, and you look at the regime though, and you look at what the regime has been able to deliver them in in the year 1999, GDP per capita in China was $900. Mm-hmm. That's $900. Yep. unadjusted. Fast forward, it's like 11,000.
Yeah.
Now let's pretend that since 1999, you and I never got to vote for the government of our own country, but we're 10 times better off than we were.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't really care.
Yeah.
If I'm that much better off now, like what could I possibly have told them to do differently?
Yeah.
So like there is a lot of political stability there because the regime has earned it. And second of all, if you are going to protest and make it political, there's going to be big trouble for you.
Yeah.
That's no joke. Like, I'm not trying to be like a China basher or anything, but like, I think everyone knows that's the truth.
Yeah.
You can protest, hey, that there's pollution here, or, something like that. As long as it's like non-political stuff, as soon as you start straying into anything political, and even some environmental protests, they've started cracking down on those a little bit because, it started to veer toward the political. The regime does not brook any amount of interference there. And, there are a lot of ethnic minorities in the country. The Han population is overwhelmingly predominant. There are some areas where they aren't. Obviously, Xinjiang gets a lot of play there. Part of the problem, though, is, it's young people who are going to make revolutions. And China's population is like the fastest graying one on earth.
Yeah.
And so
and they have
older.
And there's the aspect of the, not enough women in certain.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, obviously it could fragment, and I obviously hope that they liberalize that stuff. Will it actually happen? It's just gonna be one of those things where, like you said, everyone thought the Soviet Union was forever.
Yeah.
Till it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. And I've really enjoyed this. I wish we had like 2 more hours to talk, but life goes on, and we'll have to call it a night for tonight. But definitely, if either the financial stuff, fiscal policy and Fed stuff, and or Asia news, I will get back to you. What are you working on? I'll let you plug the books again. And you said what you may be working on right now. Just give everybody a preview of what you're doing.
That'd be great. Okay, so like I said, I do a couple articles a month at the Mises Institute, and then I do a piece every Thursday at the Libertarian Institute. The 2 books so far: Fake China Threat, and then The National Debt and You. And then the book that I'm working on, I've been working on it for a while. It's a pretty intense book, but it's First Steps in Search of Monsters to Destroy U.S. Foreign Policy from 1865 to 1898.
Wow, so that's what. Do you have a timeline on when that'll be out?
I've been making a lot of progress recently, so I'm feeling very optimistic. But there's so much research that goes into it, because so much of it is me going through and reading every single cable and diplomatic dispatch going back and forth between like Hamilton Fish and some charge d'affaires, and then consulting like what were the newspapers saying at the time. So like it's very laborious. I don't know. I really feel like January or February.
Okay.
I feel like the final draft should be done in the next couple months, and then there's an extended period of like reading and editing and back and forth. But in the next year for sure.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely have you back on when that comes out, but hopefully I'll do my best to have you back on once or twice before then. If I don't want to take you away from your meeting that deadline too much, but once in a while we'll check in and say hi. Okay.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it.
All right. See you, Joe. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.